All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our July 2016 class on the South Node in Capricorn, or the 10th house. Before we get started, first of all, here at EAN, you can study with us 3 different ways. Our free weekly audio podcast, our Astro Library, and our multimedia course. Here's the slide on the Astro Library. I'm going to go through these kind of fast because it took me a little extra time to get on today, so you can see this on your screen. Here's our multimedia course that you can also see on our screen. And of course, future classes. And so you can take a glance here. Still need a volunteer for South Node in the 9th house next month if anybody's watching or catches this after the live class. And here are the rest of the classes right here. And of course, today's subject again. I'm also going to go through these classes pretty fast as well. Most of us are familiar with North Node, South Node points in space. It's where the moon's path interacts the plane of the ecliptic, which is the Earth's actual path around the sun. Although from here on Earth, it looks as though it is the sun moving around the ecliptic. And so the ecliptic is that interaction between the moon's path and the sun's path. Nodal axis moves around the zodiac approximately every 18.5 years. It's retrograde 90% of the time. It takes about 18 months to go through each sign of the zodiac. South Node, of course, is the soul's ego from the past, the accumulation of all the emotional residues from all of our past lives. It represents security, karma, the point of familiarity, also the point of stagnation. North Node, leading edge development of the soul's ego in this life, represents insecurity because it is uncharted or unknown territory. It's the dharma, the future of the ego. It's the magnetic pull forward. It is the point of movement within the ego. The nodal axis is always in the tension of the present moment. And the South Node represents the past, the North Node represents the future, and the present moment is always the moon. Both are natal moon signature by house sign aspects and the transiting node. And you can even bring the transiting nodal axis in here as well. But you get the point. South Node, North Nodes are points in space relative to the moon. And there we get past, present, and future. Of course, for many of us, the past is always trying to shape the future in the present moment by projecting the past forward for security reasons. And that retrograde mean motion of the nodes basically represent, help in leaving that past behind on an egoic basis and charting forward into that new unknown territory. All right, that was fast. You can refer back to the slides if you're not familiar with this information. So when we start looking at that South Node in either Capricorn or 10th house, it is going to represent souls who've been learning how to establish a sense of individuality and authority within any culture or society from an emotional outer security perspective. So in general, our societal laws and customs, they can evolve over time, and they can either be established by the consensus of society's members or imposed upon society by whoever is in power. And again, society and culture will represent the collective authority that dictates how any individuals in that society or culture are expected to conduct themselves. In essence here, what we've described in these last 2 points is the consensus world. Now, we also will have countries that have borders that define its relationship to other countries, and in that same respect, each individual is going to have its own boundaries, perimeters, limitations relative to his or her social position and function within a society. So just like a country has boundaries and has boundaries with other countries, defines its relationship, Saturn, Capricorn 10th house in health and wellness astrology, represents the skin, represents literally the boundaries of the physical body and how those bodies or individuals in that physical outer world relate to others. South Node in Capricorn or 10th house egos are learning how to define their own individual security, or excuse me, their own individuality and emotional security through whatever their social position or function is. Whether we work or not, we will all have the social position and functions. We can have a stay-at-home mom. We can have a retiree or somebody who's disabled. Not everybody will be in the work environment, although Capricorn in 10th house many times will represent the whole issue of work. In order to have this social position or function, we have to learn how any given society works in order to then function within it and accomplish whatever our desires and goals may be. So when we have a South Node in Capricorn or 10th house, we're going to have an ego from the past that has expended its emotional energy toward meeting its goals and desires through some social position or function, either within or outside that work environment. South Node in Capricorn and 10th house egos have also been learning discipline, self-determination, and submission to a higher authority. Again, Capricorn 10th house Saturn in general is going to represent a higher authority in whatever culture or society we find ourselves in. We have to get along with it to a certain degree unless we happen to be the hermit in the mountains that never interacts with anybody, even on just the minimalistic levels. We all have interactions in society. And so this ego structure is coming from, again, wanting to figure out how it works and then how do I function within it. These egos have also been learning lessons in social and emotional maturity. How do I function in a healthy way in any given society? And how have I found emotional security in functioning through any society or culture? Many times this social and emotional maturity is learned through whatever the nature of our individual beliefs, values, desires, needs are, and linking that individual purpose to social purpose. Now, obviously, within this statement right here, this is going to be done in a much different way between those who are consensus evolutionary state of consciousness versus individuated and spirituated. However, regardless of the evolutionary state, we will many times find that souls are going to be born into nations that are going to reflect their own individual karmic and evolutionary needs and how best those can be learned through that nation, through that society, through the vibrations of any nation as it creates its own laws, customs, taboos, etc. One exception to this is when we have, say for instance, Pluto in Sagittarius or ninth house, nodal axis in Sagittarius or ninth house, someone who maybe has a bunch of planets in Sag or the ninth house, they can sometimes be born into a country that does not reflect their karmic evolutionary needs. When that is the case, it's not always the case, they can find themselves gravitating to other places that will reflect that. But here again, we have an ego structure from the past that has been learning social and emotional maturity through functioning in society. In general, fourth house in Cancer will describe experiences with parents in the early environment. In other words, how our self-image was conditioned by our parents. Whereas the 10th house in Capricorn will describe experiences with what we call, quote unquote, extended family, that country or culture in which we grew up in. In other words, this is the social identity that we create from all of the people that surround us as we mature and become adults. Many times you will find that South Node in Capricorn or 10th house egos, they have desired and gravitated to positions of social power or status. Many of these egos will have occupied positions of power in past lives, and power is a relative term. It's going to be relative to the evolutionary state of consciousness within the soul, and it's going to be relative to the environmental conditionings that any soul has experienced throughout the accumulation of all their past lives. Many who have this South Node ego structure have learned how any system works, any culture, any country, any society. We will have some with South Node in Capricorn or 10th house that have learned how to manipulate the system to their own advantage. They've learned how it works so well, they can utilize the system, manipulate the system to get to the top. It is that famous quote, the end justifies the means. In other words, it doesn't matter how you do it as long as you end up where you want to go. The good old Capricorn 10th house goals. And so, when this is the case, there's going to be an emotional desire and security for social power or status. And it's going to reflect the need to be in a position of control within society rather than allowing society to either control them or guide them or advise them. Again, these are people who, if the end justifies the means, they will make excuses for any personal responsibility when they are gaming the system. Doesn't matter how we do it, we just want to get to the top. We want to be the one in charge. We want the one with the resources, the power, the control, etc., etc. If you look at this in general right here on this slide, just outside of the South Node signature, again, you can see that this is a lot of consensus society, especially if they have any influence by patriarchal conditionings. All we have to do is look around in some of our modern political circles to see how all of this has been used to some degree in various ways. When there is a very strong egoic desire for social power and status with this signature, it can lead to karmic and evolutionary problems in two different ways. The South Node in Capricorn or 10th house can become overly identified on emotional levels with their career, position, or status, or the manipulating and using of others for one's own ends. Either one of these issues can lead to abuse of power. And again, with this ego structure, especially if all of your emotional and physical security is linked to your outer world, your outer position. And for a few with this ego structure, the effort to maintain power at any cost can assume some real ugly forms. And there will be all kinds of rationales and excuses to justify their actions, and yet they can come across as being very pious, being very right. South Node in Capricorn 10th house egos have also been learning lessons on how to be responsible for one's own actions. For those who have manipulated others to achieve their own ends, it's quite possible that they'll come into this life with subconscious guilt patterns as a result of these prior errors and actions. Now, in general, guilt occurs as a standard of conduct, and when we deviate from that standard of conduct. Now, 10th house, Capricorn, Saturn archetype in general brings on what we would call consensus or societal guilt. Many times these standards of conduct is defined by a society or culture or nature. And if we're consensus, we can't step outside and recognize these standards of conduct as maybe being distorted from natural law. If we have this South Node ego structure and we're individuating and spirituating, we're learning to step outside of any consensus standards of conduct. However, many of us will have come through lifetimes evolving through the consensus, and we can be conditioned with this consensus guilt and not understand it in conscious ways as we're trying to step outside consensus standards of conduct and recognize natural law standards of conduct. Regardless of the evolutionary state, consensus, individuating, spirituating, any abuse of power, all those end justifies the means, the manipulations, the ability to know how the system works to move through it faster. Any abuse of power is ultimately not right, no matter how it is rationalized. In other words, all souls are going to have a deep inner sense of what is ultimately right and wrong. And this is going to be derived from the Jupiter Sag 9th house archetype and our own intuition, our own inner sense of understanding natural law, even if it has been suppressed and buried for lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes. In other words, even consensus state of consciousness has an ability to understand that hurting or killing another person is not right. We won't always understand on a conscious level this sense of right or wrong. But from this ninth house archetype, what's already there in the 10th house Capricorn Saturn archetype is, again, deep unconscious sense of understanding right and wrong. So when we have this South Node ego structure, we are going to be trying to throw off any of these distorted standards of conduct that make us feel guilty. So when you see this South Node signature in Capricorn or 10th house, as an astrologer, especially a counseling astrologer, you would really want to work with the client, ask them questions, see if you can understand where they come from with what they have accumulated as standards of right-wrong conduct. Are they aligning with what we will call natural law? Have they been distorted? Do they have guilt over it? Is it conditioned guilt? Is it natural guilt? Are they trying to break free? So there's a lot to this sense of judgment and guilt based upon standards of conduct that are conditioned versus natural. Sometimes we'll have South Node in Capricorn or 10th house egos that will come into this life with a deep emotional sense of inherent or natural guilt that cannot be rationally explained in the current life experiences. Now, this will only occur when they have had negative or misguided behavioral responses to this archetype, to this South Node ego structure in Capricorn or 10th house. Now, sometimes we can have a sense of emotional guilt that can exist on deep levels, especially, for instance, if we're going to be working with the Pluto in Virgo generation. Here again, you have to really work to be that astrological detective, and you cannot assume that if they come in with this sense of guilt, and on a Capricorn 10th house South Node, it's going to be right there in the ego, so it will feel a little more conscious sometimes, and yet it can be the distortions of the patriarchal conditionings doubling down, so to speak. For instance, again, my example is the Pluto in the Pluto in Virgo generation, or natal Pluto in the 6th house. If they have this South Node ego structure, they have a double signature of the guilt archetype. And you really have to come through and work with discerning whether it is natural guilt and there needs to be atoning for it, or there's been a lot of conditioned guilt via religious distortions, Virgo 6th house, or societal conditionings and pressures with this ego structure. So many times when it's inherent or natural guilt, what will happen here is there's going to be an inhibiting effect in their life. They can feel like they don't deserve anything. They can feel resigned. They can feel pessimistic. They can be blocked from getting anywhere regardless of how many or how much effort they make. That's going to lead us more towards that inherent or natural guilt. Here again, we're going to have some discernment and really be that astrological detective. Because, for instance, if we have Pluto in Virgo generation or 6th house, we can also have the self-sabotage going on. And so there's going to need to be that Q&A between astrologer and client. There's going to be that back and forth to decide, do they sincerely make an effort and they get nowhere? Or do they make a partial effort, half an effort, self-sabotage? Then you're going to lean more towards that conditioned guilt in some way that they are needing to break free from. And with this ego structure, if it is the conditioned guilt, there definitely has to be that self-determination, self-responsibility, follow through on the efforts to really move forward. They're going to also have to look at, for instance, if it's Pluto Virgo or 6th house natally, their beliefs on deep levels that will have them continuing to self-sabotage. Sometimes with this ego structure, again, there can be some pretty major frustrations because they can't seem to get ahead when they make the effort. Some of them will block themselves and close their own door because on some level, subconsciously, unconsciously, they know that they're here to make amends and atone in some way. Regardless, when we have this condition where they can't seem to get ahead, either way, natural guilt, conditioned guilt, societal guilt, religious guilt, it is going to start enforcing a real deep emotional reflection that will allow the individual to become aware of their own inner motivations and dynamics, and especially on emotional levels and all of the emotions that are connected to these types of dynamics that have them self-sabotage or have them not be able to get ahead regardless. If they're not willing to do this deep emotional reflection, they can experience depression, futility, utter lack of power. Again, the natural purpose of depression is to turn us inward for inner reflection. Why is it like this way? Why is my life like this? What is it that I need to do differently? And so there would be, working with this ego structure, there would be the invitation to continually work through any of these emotional triggers that turn them inward, that have them feeling pessimistic or futile or what difference does it make. It would be encouraging them to, again, really psychologically reflect upon this in order to move it forward a little bit. I'm going to put my headphone down because as you can hear, my mama's here. I better close my door. Hey, honey. All right, I'm back. Sometimes we will have South Node in Capricorn or 10th house, in which the ego will draw in familial situations where one or both parents will be stern disciplinarians. They can impose rigid standards of conduct upon them as children. We can draw in familial situations in which one parent may leave the scene or abandon the responsibility of parenting. We can also draw in the scene where this ego structure can be in a relationship with children, and we can even have the partner abandoning them, and they have to take on responsibility for both parental roles. There can be a variety of different familial situations here with South Node in Capricorn or 10th house. So when we have these familial situations of discipline and rigid standards and, over responsibility or the abandonment by parents, again, it will be leading these individuals to emotionally reflect early on the actions of one or both of the parents they were born into. And ultimately, this is going to reflect their own need to judge themselves relative to their own standards of conduct. It will also represent that North Node in Cancer in the 4th of these egos needing to create their own inner emotional security. And if we have the situation where this South Node ego structure has a partner who does not participate in the parenting of any children they have, it will still cause them to reflect inwardly and reflect upon their own standards of conduct and how they are choosing to parent children as well. Some egos with the South Node in Capricorn or 10th house may have been very judgmental in their past. They could have judged others against whatever the standards of conduct were that they identified with in one of their past lives in whatever society or culture they were born into. We will also have some South Nodes in Capricorn or the 10th house in which others have heavily judged them. This will reflect the need, if they've been judged, to be able to stand up to others, to be able to correct others judging them. And many times, either way, whether this ego structure has been judgmental or whether they have been judged, it will come down to, again, those consensus standards of conduct versus what we will call natural law standards of conduct. The most simplest example is a standard of conduct by society in which the only way to have sex is when you're married and someone has an affair outside of a relationship. And so we could have this ego structure judging the one who has the affair. We could have them having the affair and others judging them. And as we know from natural law versus consensus religions, all souls have a dual desire sexually to commit and to be wild. We do not have inherent monogamy in our species at this point in space-time on planet Earth. And so who are we to judge a particular situation? There can be all kinds of other examples. Doesn't have to be just sexuality. It can be anything and everything that anybody wants to apply a standard of right, wrong conduct to. Obviously, this can also very much include a lot of familial situations. Parents judging a Capricorn 10th house South Node ego because they are not towing the line with the familial standards of conduct. And we can have this ego structure doing the same thing with their own children, wanting the children to behave according to how they think they should behave versus making that effort to understand the child as the individual soul it actually is. Sometimes we'll have a South Node in Capricorn or 10th house where the ego has been learning lessons of self-determination and self-discipline. Won't be some. This would be almost all South Node ego structures learning self-determination and self-discipline with this archetype. Self-determination can be defined as identifying one's goals, abilities, desires, capacities, and making the effort to actualize them through one's own emotional and physical efforts. So just making up one's mind and putting the emotional, physical energy into creating it. Here, we're also going to have that need to identify what our natural function is within society, and then to actualize the potential of that function through whatever ways and means are prescribed by society. In other words, the example that I remember, with Jeffrey Green, if you want to be a doctor, you're going to have to go to medical school. If you want to be a therapist in the consensus world, you're going to go to traditional schooling. In the individuating and spirituating world, you may turn to alternative educations. Of course, as you know, those of us who are astrologers, we're about as alternative as they come. Many of us are self-educated, or you find your way to a place like EAN where you are going to some type of alternative schooling to learn some alternative method. Regardless, consensus or alternative, it requires us to have that self-determination, that self-discipline, and then to commit on a sustained level to create it. And what we can have with this Capricorn 10th house archetype, because it is the cardinal archetype, we initiate, but we do not follow through. And so you can see here how we've really got to bring in the emotions with this ego structure to do it, and to do it out there in the world. So, because of this cardinal archetype, sometimes this ego structure has settled for less in some of the most recent prior lives. Either we did not learn the appropriate ways to do it according to society or the culture we connected with in order to get to the goal, or we refuse to make the effort. We started it and let it go. We can have both of these. We either didn't want to take the time to learn the process that society or the culture wanted, or we just didn't want to make the effort. And when that's the case, we're still going to be learning this lesson in the current life with this ego structure. If we did not make that prior life effort, or we didn't learn the appropriate ways to do it, we can then also go through these cycles: pessimism, depression. We can have jealousy towards those who appear to be functioning in society, those who are actually functioning in society in successful ways. Sometimes this ego structure will not be able to accept the limits of their own social capacity. And again, sometimes they may be unable to follow the necessary means of actualizing what they have the capacity or ability to do. This again, when they have this pessimism and depression, it's the catalyst for turning them inward and reflecting. Is this where my soul needs to be for my highest and best? Is this where my social role and capacity is meant to be? Or am I to recognize that I need to make the follow-through effort, the self-discipline, the self-determination to really get there? And so, for these egos that have either settled for less or have not made the effort or can't accept where they naturally are, will have that good old guilt come through. And guilt then serves as the catalyst for the inner awareness of why they have failed to achieve their potential. And if they don't want to recognize this on an inner level, this ego structure can take the guilt and project it outward. They will blame their conditions on society, on other people in general, on their family, on their partner, on their loved ones. They'll blame it on all kinds of outer conditions. And what this ego structure really has to recognize on deep levels, it doesn't just happen out of the blue. The responsibility is ultimately their own. Whatever these outer manifestations of conditions turn out to be for these souls, the responsibility for it is their own. Now, there could be those karmic situations where they'll be born into families where the parents can again reinforce the guilt. If the child's not acting according to their standards of conduct, this can, typically happen when we have individuating and spiritual souls that are born into consensus families. And we can also have this ego structure blame the parents if they refuse to accept their own self-responsibility for their conditions or their situations or their lot in life. And, we could even have, for instance, We could have someone in individuating or spirituated states of consciousness that perhaps have a lot of Taurus in their chart or second house in their chart. And they just don't want to make the effort. They can have that laziness of Taurus or the second house, and they can blame their parents. They could even blame the consensus parents. If they do that, sooner or later that guilt, especially the natural guilt, will eat away and eat away and eat away. They can have whatever resources those consensus parents have built up taken away. So they may be forced to make an effort in order to pay the rent or put food on the table. Again, there can be all kinds of scenarios, as those of us who've looked at a few charts can recognize. When we have South Node in Capricorn or 10th house egos who have mastered those lessons of self-determination and self-discipline, especially with wherever their social functioning is, it's possible that they have held meaningful social positions in past lives. They've made the prior efforts. So they come into this lifetime and they can actualize their social functions with little or minimal effort due to these prior life efforts. When this is the case, many times these roles will be of a positive nature. They'll be of a positive emotional impact within wherever they are working or within whoever they are coming into contact with in society. That means these ego structures have learned how to conduct themselves in relation to transcultural and timeless standards of conduct. And when they have been evolving along these lines, they can play very meaningful roles in helping others and inspiring others to improve their own lives. Now, this can be done on a small scale, it can be done on a large scale. Again, the rest of the overall chart structure will start to determine exactly how this is going to operate for any individual soul. The point is that it's not all going to be quote unquote negative and hard effort and making amends for guilt, etc. We can have those who, again, have really made efforts, and so they can actually come in and express those natural leadership qualities that are germane to Capricorn and 10th house archetype. Their egos know how to do it, and they come in and actually will fulfill whatever those leadership qualities or social roles are according to their evolutionary state. In other words, this can happen consensus individuated or spirituated. These will be ego structures that can act as role models for others who wish to emotionally motivate themselves the same way. They can be the role models that influence others towards higher standards of conduct or more natural law standards of conduct. These will be ego structures that naturally understand that they are self-responsible for their own emotions, their own actions, their own outer securities. They naturally will not use devious means to achieve their ambitions. They will feel contempt and dislike for those who do resort to devious ways, and they will call them out on it. They will have the ability to use natural authority and confront them and point out the distortions, point out the manipulating end justifies the means. They will expose those types of tactics to others and hold that line to, again, natural timeless standards of conduct and require others to clean up their act. When this is the case, sometimes they will have had a parent or parents who understand this and support and encourage them in their lives. Sometimes one parent is supportive and the other is not. Sometimes they didn't have either parent support them, and it will be their own natural soul energy that helps them recognize this and to move through it. Now, the 10th house Capricorn and Saturn is the archetype in general in which we all come face to face with our own mortality, in which we understand this whole concept of time and space. So when we have a South Node in Capricorn or 10th house, this is an ego structure that feels this awareness more acutely. They're more sensitive to mortality and space and time than other nodal signatures. And so again, this helps them naturally learn those lessons of social and emotional maturity. We need to grow up. We need to become an adult. They're also more acutely aware of any sense of timing than other nodal signatures. Now, one of the things that can happen, though, with this archetype is sometimes this South Node ego structure will grow up too fast, and they will take on responsibilities as a child. They don't get to be the child. This will then represent those lessons in learning to heal their inner wounded child. When this is the case, we can sometimes also have situations where this ego structure learns how to be a child later in life. They learn how to be more playful or joyful or not take things so seriously and learn to be more emotionally open and go with the flow in that case. We also have with this nodal axis structure the same thing as when we have Pluto in Cancer 4th or Capricorn 10th. When the nodal axis structure is this way, doesn't matter where the North Node, South Node is. If it's in Cancer, Capricorn 10th or 4th, either way, we can have situations where these souls have switched genders in their most recent prior lives. We may have them preparing to switch genders. Again, there's going to need to have that interaction with the chart in question to see where it's at here. We can also have the situation where the current life is the first time they are experiencing this opposite gender in many lifetimes. When this is the case, it can easily signal a state of imbalance that has been reached, and there is no more evolutionary growth in the previous gender. They must come through in this new gender. It requires the gender switch to have growth, evolution, and balance. Again, that ultimate androgyny that we're all striving towards. When we have these gender switchings, and especially if it's the first time, there can be hormonal shifts that can create all kinds of emotional moods and feelings that are difficult to relate to, that are difficult to control. Emotions can seem to just be all over the place and have a life of their own. And what we can find here, especially if that South Node is in Capricorn or 10th, there's an unconscious reaction to suppress or control any and all emotions. Sometimes there's parental influences to do that. You're not allowed to be a child. You're not allowed to have any emotions of any kind. And so, what's really going on here is to become aware of the source of any triggers that produce these moods and emotions. In other words, to go for that famous why is this happening? Where is this coming from? What's being triggered unconsciously, subconsciously, and coming to the surface? What is it to teach me? What am I to learn? What's my next lesson in emotional self-reliance? The distortion is feeling victimized by them or suppressing the emotions. Again, we're striving for self-knowledge, and we're striving to learn that ultimate lesson of androgyny and balancing the genders, balancing the inner male and the inner female, regardless of what that physical gender is in the current life. All right, that's my slides for South Node in Capricorn 10th. I'll see if I can move through this North Node a little fast. Questions or comments, you're always welcome to type something in the board, the Q&A to Leroy. He'll respond back to you. If he feels that I need to interact, he can either unmute you or Leroy will forward the question on. You're always welcome to ask questions when you want. We do have 2 chart examples here, so I'll move through this a little faster, I hope. When we have the North Node in Cancer or the 4th house, the emotional intent of the ego is to learn and develop an internal security, a self-identity, a personal fulfillment that is not bound up or linked to the need for success or social position. That North Node in Cancer and the 4th house is to really internalize emotional security so that outer world can ebb and flow. And we can maintain that emotional homeostasis regardless. It's learning to see ourselves first on an inner emotional level without the trappings or security that a social function or career can provide. And for any of us who work outside the home, inside the home, for those of us who are not retired and have these social functions that we've got to perform, just think for a moment of how your security can get tied up with that, especially if it comes with the trappings of a paycheck. How many of us could give up that paycheck in the moment and be inwardly secure? You can just see there going from that South Node Cap 10th to North Node Cancer 4th. In general, what a lesson it is to internalize security. We're also learning emotional self-reliance. This is most commonly learned through our familial structure. And if we didn't have it with this South Node Capricorn 10th, it can really put the lesson on as we mature to be able to do it and learn it ourselves, regardless of the familial situation. And when it is, through those various familial structures, we can have support or lack of support through the parents, the partner, the children. There can be all kinds of scenarios moving us forward to learn it in these various ways. We can also have emotional shocks that will come through the parents, the partner, and or the children. And when we receive these emotional shocks, what is happening here is the Cancer or fourth house North Node will then go into a deep self-examination, especially on emotional levels. Why do I feel this way? What is triggering these emotions? What does it mean? Who am I? Why am I insecure? Why do I feel this way? Why am I shutting down? All of these throwing us in upon ourselves on emotional levels is to try and help us find deeper and broader emotional homeostasis, self-reliance, inner security. And so it behooves us to not turn around and project it back out there on the parents, partner, and or children, but to see them as the mirror, as the catalyst, helping us learn this lesson. Now, in the situations where there are the judgmental parents or the consensus parents that do not understand a North Node in Cancer, fourth house on an individual level or spiritual level, this also forces this ego structure in upon him or herself. And it can be there on that ultimate karmic level to help force that self-examination on that inner emotional basis. So can we really work with releasing the judgment projected back, releasing the blame projected back, and really work with our own healings in these areas? Again, recognizing we chose this circumstance and situation for how it would help us. And that process of the emotional shocks is almost necessary. It occurs so that the North Node in, Cancer in the fourth house can again understand the nature and basis of their own emotions, create that sense of internal security that is not linked to external conditions. It requires the individual to discover their own inner dynamics that created this. And when we go inward, it can produce the self-knowledge that will help us make peace with whatever our life conditions are, good, bad, and everything in between, and to accept the self-responsibility for it. When this ego structure experiences family difficulties with their own children, it can have the same effect as the parental environment they were born into. It can force them to again self-examine on some of the deepest levels, so they can bring in those quote-unquote problem children. This can reflect karma from past lives between them and the children. Sometimes they can bring in children who are very aware, drawing in one of those little Pluto and Sag souls who calls them out on their rationalizing or Pollyanna BS. Drawing in the Pluto and Scorpio children who call them out on their emotional suppressions or projections. Either way, problem children, aware children, forcing these individuals inward. North Node in Cancer fourth is going within and processing through emotionally. Sometimes we can have that South Node Cap 10th ego structure, as we talked before. They can neglect their own children because of their own career. Never know their children. When this is the case, the children don't know the parent. Sooner or later, it can produce guilt. That again forces the self-examination, forces the going inward to discover these inner dynamics, to get in touch with their own emotions, to learn how to emotionally relate to the children. If they've done this in past lives, then they might be more aware of it coming into this life with their own children and making the amends in those ways. All the various familial situations create these emotional shocks and confrontations. It forces these individuals to examine who and what they are, to examine the reasons and dynamics that determine their own emotional behaviors, wounds. It forces them to reflect on how they identify themselves and what constitutes security on an emotional level, meaning progressively moving forward with deeper and deeper inner emotional security. That right career or social position can be blocked to also enforce these types of emotional lessons. It doesn't just have to come from the family. Again, as we've learned, it can come from society forcing the individual inward. So when that right career or social position is blocked, they can be held down to force that inner emotional security. Sometimes they can create success early on and then have that fall from grace in some way that's forcing them inward emotionally. Sometimes they can consciously become aware of how all the social positions represent been there, done that, I've learned that, and I need to walk away and really work on my self-discovery on inner emotional levels. And when that's the case, they will reflect upon any internal dynamics to become aware of how those dynamics created emotional security with career, how those internal dynamics created their realities, their inner self-image and security. There's an inner reflection, if you're grasping this, that just must continually go on with this North Node ego structure. It allows them to shed the past however they need to, the outer past and the inner past, to shed outworn emotions and emotional patterns. It allows them to, again, cardinal archetype, it allows them to reorganize themselves and to continually evolve their self-image. to continually create a new self in whatever ways are necessary, inwardly and outwardly. To be able to detach from that outer world, however, whenever necessary. It allows them to accept greater and greater self-responsibility for their own actions, their own conditions. They internalize those security needs more and more and more, to the point that even if they lose it all, they'll be okay. And so the ever-evolving realizations of these lessons removes any blocks to meaningful careers or social functions. Again, they can naturally fall into whatever is theirs to do in society, on whatever level, large or small. They will also achieve a balance between downtime or inner time and privacy and external responsibilities. In other words, balancing their inner world with their outer world, and to be able to follow those emotional triggers, pushing them inward or pushing them outward. So instead of those huge emotional shocks that have to come along with family and loved ones or society, they can learn to recognize subtle emotional triggers that are pulling them in or telling them it's time to go out. And they balance again inner self-reliance on emotional levels with outer duties and obligations. North Node in Cancer, 4th house eagles will learn that the beliefs and values that condition their ideas about what life is and how it should be lived are purely subjective. In other words, their judgments apply only to themselves in relation to their own standard of conduct, and they can release judging others, and they will then find themselves lessening, attracting others, judging them. And they learn to accept that self-responsibility for their own lives, including whatever duties and obligations are theirs to perform and accept. They can inspire and motivate others to do the same. They are able to realize these goals and ambitions with self-determination, and they do it in honest and non-manipulative ways. They do the same, they encourage others to do the same. And they also learn to be responsible parents who are productive and giving. They learn to be emotionally available, even with the karma kids that they may draw to themselves. All right, so that's it. I'm going to take a drink of water here before we move into charts quickly. Looking at time, I will try and divide it up about 20-25 minutes. We'll go the full 2 hours. So for those of you who have to leave early, I understand the delay in getting started. Thank you to the volunteers who can hopefully stick around. I think both our volunteers are live, and Leroy, our first volunteer, is going to be male. But I'm going to take a drink of water. Comments or questions before we move on? Anything that I forgot?
All right, well, I see a male on the board. I'm going to give it a guess and unmute our only male. It appears to be, yeah. It could be our only male tonight or this afternoon. Welcome to the club.
Yay. Thank you.
It's a very low. It can be a very lonely club for us males.
Leroy appreciates you showing up.
Awesome.
I'm going to take one more drink, okay?
Oh, am I unmuted?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
You
okay.
you are unmuted. You are live. We can hear you. You sound very good. So good connection.
Yeah.
And yes,
Yeah. Thank
thank you.
you. Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you. This material is amazing.
Well, good. You know what I've kind of been doing here, first, just quickly, our mail chart is May 16th, 1964, 10 a.m. London, Ontario in Canada, the rising is about 23 degrees Cancer. We have a third house Pluto, 11-12 Virgo retrograde. Uranus is balsamic from the second. Here, as you can see, we're going to have a south node in Capricorn, sixth house, ruler Saturn. Up here, Pisces, eighth by sign, ruler by house Mercury in a Taurus stellium in the 10th house. And of course, north node Cancer, 12th, ruler moon, 0, 1 degrees Leo first by sign, and by house is Neptune over here in Scorpio. I'll describe more, but here's what I have a tendency to do coming off of all of this. I'd like to hear from you first. What is just really striking you in regards to the slides today?
Um,
And you're welcome to just rattle off what was really there for you emotionally. Haha.
oh, a lot. Well, I'm a person, and you can probably see this by my chart, that I've had a big battle with my emotional body all of my life. I've been very emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's a few points just that I wrote down here is this balance between the inner world and the outer world. I've been learning that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been a workaholic. I mean, I'm a spiritual teacher, but I've brought that kind of consciousness of workaholism to
Mm-hmm.
my work. In the last couple of years, I've been really getting it that I matter too. So
Yes.
this is, and this ties into this lost childhood that I wrote to you about, that I felt. And it's like I'm learning, like I'm camping right now on my own, just with my little dog, but learning, like, what do I want from my life other than work? And these are, I mean, I think these are easy questions for other people to answer, but they're not for me. So I'm learning about myself in that sense, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
reclaiming my inner child. And ironically, I teach people spiritual adulthood. I teach people to reparent their inner child. So I feel like I'm sharing what I've already learned through this
Mm-hmm.
North Node
Mm-hmm.
in Cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And then taking responsibility for my life. I've really learned that one. And then guilt. So you were talking a lot about guilt, and I totally relate to that because I've had guilt around money, and so I've done some past life regression and letting go of religious vows made about a vow of poverty, a vow of celibacy. So I feel like that's where my guilt comes
Mm-hmm.
from.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing bothers me more than a teacher, a spiritual teacher, or a person in power abusing that power. I
Mm-hmm.
get so riled up. Like I get so angry inside
Mm-hmm.
myself. So those were the big like emotional triggers that were up for
Mm-hmm.
me when you were talking.
Sure. Let me just share briefly. Come from a family environment where you said part-time Catholic. It was more about the appearance of being a good Christian,
Yeah.
skeptical of religions early on. You wrote a lot about mom. It was all about how we looked.
Yeah.
Um, she really wanted tried to have you suppress your emotions, the public mask. She couldn't understand how sensitive you were early on. You've done a lot of forgiveness work around her, especially when she passed. She was 32. You were 32 when she
Yeah.
crossed over. It triggered a lot of grief. Very close to nature. You were married for 12 years. You've been divorced since 2012. Too many adult responsibilities as a child, didn't have a childhood. Terrified of speaking in groups, panic attacks. You worked through that in your 30s, and then you spoke about a couple of different past lives, and there seems to be a number of lifetimes around religion
Yeah.
and all of the distortions that have come from that. My question for you, you didn't write one thing about your father. What's the
Oh,
background with father?
he was a military policeman, so he was the disciplinarian.
Oh, boy,
But he
yeah,
was
yeah.
but oddly enough, he was the really sensitive one. I mean, he would let himself vent his emotions at like Old Yeller and movies like that, but that's about it around animals.
Hmm. Did you feel both your
Yeah.
parents were more or less consensus?
Yes, it was all about fitting in and put in this script, right? Get
Yeah.
married, have the kids, the family, get
Hmm.
the secure job, plan for retirement, and I could see through that even as a child.
Hmm. Were you an only
This
child?
is not going to make me happy. No, I have a brother. He's 18 months younger than me.
Okay. All
So he
right.
basically followed their route
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as a consensus adult.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you really have had the emotional shocks from the entire familial environment to help you really, really step aside and break free from all
Hmm.
of the outer material conditionings because you can see a wide, not even a wide, you can see how there's an earth trine that's drawn in here, and so yes, I can see where it might be possible either the vows of poverty or even perhaps a lifetime or two in which there was the materialism can be why you are so triggered around people who distort that because you may have had a lifetime yourself in which you're doing that. And now to be healing that and bringing it to some type of balance where you don't have to starve yourself anymore.
Hmm.
You
I
don't
agree.
have,
Yeah.
yeah, where we have a balanced relationship with the material world versus extremes on either side.
Hmm.
I would just say you're really trying to fine tune being able to walk this spiritual path and the ruler by house right here, in a creative material world and just be able to be at peace with it seems to be some of what's coming through.
Hmm.
Um, some of your busybodiness can be around the whole guilt thing around in here. The Saturn, or excuse me, the Uranus Saturn opposition, there's distortions here and wounds here, perhaps around that material world. I'm just picking up on, and correct me if you don't agree with this or sense it. It just seems like you have a whole bunch of lifetimes that have been these extremes of non-material or material, and the patriarchal distortions have screwed it up on both ends of it. And
Hmm.
so where's the inner peace of really being able, I mean, this on some of the ultimate levels, this North Node, some of the deepest levels is being able to recognize that the ultimate resource is source, and you can be
Yes.
okay and have the material will show up and be provided for you whenever it's necessary or needed. And
Yes.
and so following through with an inner peace on that, and not self-sabotaging whenever you do naturally accumulate some degree of resources.
Hmm.
Did you have children?
No, I've always been really adamant about not having children
You could
because
explore.
I know
Go
what a
ahead.
karma, I know what a seva that is. It's like the ultimate selfless service
Yes.
to have a child. And I always knew the
Yes.
responsibility of that. A dog
Yes.
is enough for me. A dog to take care of. He's
I
a little
also,
chihuahua, so he's like a little baby.
what I also could pick up on with this Saturn signature here, and with this North Node signature and ruler Venus, or excuse me, ruler by house Neptune in the fifth, there's wounding around children. It's quite
Yeah,
possible you could have the classic signature of children torn out of your arms, so I'm just not gonna go there.
yeah. I've had a memory of my child being killed because I was speaking the truth in one of my past lives. Like my
There we
children
go.
were threatened or killed. Yeah. I get
Hmm.
so, even my little nephew, I used to get so anxious. Like I could see everything that could possibly go wrong in the scenario. It was like so stressful for me to be with him as a little
Hmm.
child.
Hmm. You might find at some point in this lifetime to um, create situations in which you really do work with children
Hmm.
and to see what healing that can bring. Um, some of the beauties, not all, but many of us know, children many times can come in, free and loving and emotionally demonstrative before we condition the crap out of them. And
That's right.
so you can find that that can create sometimes a recovery process, healing own inner wounded child, and then healing wounds around the loss of your own children on karmic levels.
Hmm.
And so instead of just working with the adult world, perhaps, and it's not that you have to create, stop one career and go to another career, but to just every so often put yourself in those situations where you are learning from the children, where you are
Hmm.
giving yourself the ability to heal with children.
Hmm. I'm
Um,
open to that.
yeah, and it can even just be strangers as children. Leroy, for instance, he's got a different nodal structure than you, uh, but he's got a lot of Leo stuff, and Jeffrey had told him, Jeffrey Green, once upon a time about his wounding around children. Before he ever knew that from Jeffrey, when Leroy's son was very young, Leroy actually went to work in a daycare for a few years,
Wow.
working through karmic atonement with children, and then just working through personal healing with his own son.
Yeah.
And when he was in the daycare, and so I don't sense for you so much as it's to atone because you were hurtful to children. It's the grief, it's the loss, it's the sensitivity,
Hmm.
and at the same time, though, in the same respect, though, the ability to go into this North Node and really work with that freedom of emotions that children can bring through, there can be some of your own inner healing. It can help
Hmm.
calm down the workaholism.
Right.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
To me, if I would sense any of the guilt dynamic, it seems to perhaps be more around the whole resources thing than necessarily the uh, karmic thing with guilt around children. I don't sense that, and you can correct me if you feel differently.
Yeah.
If you look at the moon in your chart being at 1 degrees Leo here, okay, in the first house, you've got an emotional rebirth going on in this lifetime. The Cancer ascendant, the moon signature, Venus conjunct the North Node. This all right here just says, it's okay to rediscover your trust with Source, okay? And be able to really go into the emotional body this lifetime. It's okay to
Yeah.
do all of the emotional recovery work.
Yeah.
And, this would naturally mean then at some point, if it's where your interest, or maybe it happened with the partner of 12 years, but to have that partner who can hold that safe space so that you can feel emotionally vulnerable.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
that's not in the life right now, then you can work to again recover this through children.
Yeah.
Not to mention, of course, we can always do it through animals in the sixth and the ninth houses. The mutable archetypes really work through the whole animal thing. And Jeffrey Green was he talked a lot about how when we have, and we may touch upon this next month's class as well, but when there is a lot of wounding with human to human relationships, um, it's the animal world and the plant world by which we heal to then venture back forth with the humans. And so a lot of us will have the the relationship with pets when the wounding is great with humans.
Yeah.
And yet we still have to venture back out into the human world. There
Right.
there's old teachings of Jeffrey when he first was back from Vietnam. He did his shaman nomadic days. He traveled with a dog. And I ended up when Jeffrey Green and Noel Till did some classes or some conferences in Denver in the late 90s. Um, I can't remember which one it was, but one of them. I went to all three, and I ended up going to one like 2 days after I had had a cat that I had fostered for 3 years after its owner committed suicide. um,
Mm.
I took on this kitty fostering it, and the cat had crossed over about 2 days before this conference. And so myself and a couple of other people had conversations with Jeffrey, and I remember, the conversation with him when he talked about this dog. He says, I was so emotionally wounded, Kim. I sat down on the side of the road with my deceased dog and cried for 2 days.
Mm.
And finally, the whole rigor mortis and all that kind of stuff. He says, I finally had to bury the dog and move on. And he says, I can't remember how long it was, but he says, it took me a while. But he says, my dog kept coming to me in dreams as a meteorite in the sky going, let me go. And he said, I finally got it, that I had projected so much emotions onto the dog, that
Right.
I had to let it go. And I remember that. And Leroy will have his own opinions on how emotionally attached I still am to my remaining kitty, with two that have crossed over in the last year and a half. so I've
Yeah.
always remembered that lesson. Um, so anyway, I might be wandering a little bit, but in general, the unconditional love of the animal world and the unconditional love of children are one of the ways in which we can work to do a lot of emotional healing
Hmm.
that will then allow us to, heal with the adult humans. So for
Yeah.
whatever tidbits, you or anybody else wants to take out of that, this is what I sense from the North Node nodal axis, the same ascendant sign, and this moon signature, one Leo first house. You're meant to bust out and emote
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
be free in
Yeah.
those ways.
And I find when I'm really connected with my heart is when because I'm a writer too, that's when my words
Mhm.
really penetrate and my spoken words penetrate others. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
power, emotional power, when I'm connected to my heart, not
Yes.
numbed out. That's my Capricorn, numbed out,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yep.
Yeah. And I loved
Yeah.
what you said about the animal because I actually went through a thing this morning with my dog Bougie. I found a tick on him and it just brought up so much insecurity. And it's like, where is this coming from? And fear, right? And it's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I've got to deal with the tick. And it was like, oh, my attachment to him was coming up. Like, what if he
Mm-hmm.
died and
Mm-hmm.
he was taken away from me? And it was like, oh
Mm-hmm.
my God, another trigger,
Mm-hmm.
right? It was like this fear of getting really, really close to a person or even an animal that I
Yeah.
have to just come to terms with,
So
you know?
this is where the ruler of the South Node by sign is in this, deep shamanistic signature right here. Pisces eighth house. I mean, this is a shaman signature. And
Yeah.
so and what you can relate to this is that you're okay with the physical, non-physical world and beings coming, going, crossing over when you're not emotionally involved.
Yes.
When you're emotionally involved with this double water signature here for your Saturn, that's when all the triggers of the loss and hurt, persecution can come along.
Hmm.
And so, being able to move through that on emotional levels and connect to loved ones non-physically when you're personally involved, that's also an intent right here of this North Node signature.
Mm.
Being able to feel emotionally connected to them when they're
So
non-physical.
connect with loved ones even on the earth plane, you mean?
Connect with
Non-physical.
connect with loved
Okay.
ones physically and non-physically. In other
Mm.
words, when the with the wounding of the emotional connections, for instance, puppy, um, the fear of losing him and being able to really do the emotional healing that broadens the emotional peace and understanding that you can be just as connected to them when they're right here with you physically as when they've crossed over and they're non-physical.
Right. They don't go away.
They don't go away. And
Hmm.
I've been personally learning that lesson in the last year and a half. And to the point that as I'm outside, you know, in the yard, because I'm a gardener and I had three cats down to one that absolutely loved the yard, and to just feel them in the yard. That's where I feel most connected to my two that are crossed over. Is just
Hmm.
out of the blue, I'll feel like I could turn my head and Mr. T, my free-spirited black and white, is right there. And
Mm,
so the point is, again, coming from everything being so physical here and the grief of the loss physically, double earth signatures, to then having that inner emotional understanding that we're still just a whisper away, whether I can see you and feel you and touch you or not.
mm. That's
Um,
beautiful.
I think that's some of the emotional nodal healing that you're doing. And then that also helps this busy body, double Mercury signature here, calm down and heal.
Mhm.
Let me check in quickly. Any other questions from you? Anything from anybody else on the board? Again, not enough time to do a full in-depth, but just trying to focus in on the nodal.
Yeah, no, that's very good. You've answered all my questions.
All right, all right. Well, thank you,
Thank
and
you.
enjoy enjoy nature. Leroy and I are following you in a
Yeah,
week or so.
awesome. Camping's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. All right, thank you so much. One more, Leroy. Any questions or comments from anybody on the call or in attending class live? If not, thank you very much. Leroy's going to be muting our male volunteer. Our female volunteer, I forgot to give Leroy my names, and so I have permission. Our female volunteer is going to be Colleen Leroy, if she's on, and I'm going to move on to her chart. Our female, if you're looking here, is November 26th, 1963. 2:30 p.m. She said North Adeline, Australia. My solar fire went with Adeline, and so I'll see if she wants to correct me. Both of our volunteers are spirituated. This one here is a sixth house Pluto, Uranus again, balsamic in both in Virgo. Here we have South Node Capricorn and the 10th house at about 12 degrees. Ruler Saturn is 17 Aquarius 11th. By sign, well, that rules sign and house. North Node at 12 Cancer. The moon's over here, 27 Pisces in the 12th house. Have that 7-degree rising. If she's on, you can unmute Leroy. I'm going to give the EC. Small town, lots of freedom, lots of time in nature, connecting with spirit. And at 13 years old, the mother moved them to the city, which was extremely traumatic. She went from freedom, not being allowed to go anywhere, and lost her, disconnected from this natural world she grew up in. Moving to the city, teasing, bullying, she became a fighter, rebelled, literally physically fighting with the boys. Um, Alcohol then at a very young age from the trauma. Um, Christian again, this was a little more stronger religious conditioning, extra Bible study. Actually taught Sunday school when she was young, growing up. Learned to see religion as very hypocritical, but had a strong connection to Jesus, the soul. Father was an atheist, abusive mother on all levels, cold, no love. Father weak, emotionally withdrawn, was kind to her, but then became very verbally abusing as a teenager. Father had gambling problems, so mom had to work. They barely struggled to put food on the table. She is with her husband, whom she met at 15, pregnant at 16. He left. She ended up in an unwedded mother's home with nuns, baby born. Husband came back. They married, went on to have three more children. So they have 4 kids. A lot of evolution through the relationship, and they're really trying to help each other release those separating desires. Discovered EA and the teachings of Abraham 3 years ago. This person's done a lot. A lot of what I would call metaphysical stuff, meditation, healing center, a lot of art stuff. She's currently in college. She's done clairvoyant readings 20 years. Life's been very traumatic until she's really finally been starting to calm down on a spiritual level through EA studies in the last few years. And so is our volunteer by any chance on the call?
Hi, Kim. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello there.
Oh, good. Hi.
Yes, we can hear you very well. And so do I have your chart correct? 7 degrees Aries rising?
Yes.
All right,
Yes.
good.
North Adelaide, but Adelaide's basically the same.
I kind of was, I thought so. So what I'd like to do is the same with our first volunteer. I'd kind of like you to just spontaneously speak on what really connected for you with the slides today.
Sure. I guess the biggest thing is relating to all the trauma, because I sort of feel like my life has just been one traumatic event after another. And yeah, very much relate to that Saturn in Aquarius, triggering all of that, but also through the teachings of EA, realising why that's been happening, because I used to sort of be an observer and stand back from it all and say, why is this happening? What's going on? Why are people doing this? So it's very much also into that Virgo Pluto stuff where it was externalized and, in a sense, blaming others for the behaviour and not understanding my full ability and responsibility in all of it. So EA and the teachings of Abraham have really taught me to take on that responsibility. I always felt I was a very responsible person, but I externalised a lot of things. And so my world was very external. Also very internal because of all the spiritual work I do and have done, but the emotional stuff was a real battle for me. And being extremely sensitive with the Pisces moon, everything impacted me through my life. And so I had a tendency to withdraw a lot. So if I got upset, I would just shut down. So it's taken me a long time to come to terms with, hang on, I actually have some control over this, and it's actually me who, you know, is creating these scenarios over and over in order that I return, and this is where I've come to realise this return journey and connecting on that inner level with source energy. Because I did have a lot of issues with God as such.
I didn't say to point out to anybody, so in case no one saw this, you were, you have Jupiter, retrograde,
Yes.
3 degrees inside this ascendant and square to the nodes. And if you start with Jupiter and reverse through the zodiac, the nodes are applying squares to Jupiter.
Yep.
And the south node is that resolution node. So what I was kind of picking up on is here was this early childhood and early environment, and sometimes we'll see that ascendant that way as well as that Cancer, both nodes are active in the past when a planets square the nodes, okay? And
Yes. Yep.
and so resolution node is the bottom line node to apply to for the skip steps with Jupiter. But here's the early freedom that you had out in nature. And then when you were uprooted and taken to the city and, you know, divorced from nature, this Jupiter and these Sag planets, Sag planets.
Would have been a very different life if I had Sag parents.
There was the rebel. There was the rebel that
Yes.
came out right here. This was the bust out, and all of the emotions that probably went on, because according to you, this happened at 13. It happened at puberty. So it happened right as all the emotions were starting to go forth. And what I'm kind of picking up on is a sense of, you know, the fact that you then, you know, picked up your fists. I'm picking up on the gender switching in regards to this.
Yes.
And you are perhaps coming from the male energy and not all necessarily in touch when you, especially early on, with all of the sensitive emotional energy. When you were out in nature, it was okay. You were free. You were fine. Not only did you know, you get ripped out when your hormones came along, it happened right after the Jupiter return. And so, yeah, and right here, you know, it was going on right through all of Jupiter was transiting right here when this was going on, and perhaps it happened while Jupiter was still in the first house for you as well. And so when Jupiter is square the nodes, we have skip steps with assimilating and understanding things. I know a few people who are born late November 1963. I just happen to have a few of those people in my life personally. And that Jupiter and Aries in that spontaneous jumping to conclusions, and emotions fly all over the place with this signature right here. And so there has been the need to calm this energy down, this Jupiter Aries retrograde, calm it down in order to process through and integrate and understand. And the way to do it has been, this would signify as the resolution node and this ruler in fixed air, fixed air, house and sign. These two signatures could signify that it would be later on in life before you could calm down and really start to understand and take on the emotional maturity and self-responsibility. These are your own words I'm repeating from just now. Wait a minute.
Absolutely,
this just isn't happening. What was my role in it? And so you could find yourself having, from time to time, all kinds of early environmental situations and traumas that you reflect back on. And every time you do, this Jupiter signature sparks a new aha understanding that you can then assimilate and process through.
Yes.
Okay? And
yep, very accurate. And for me too, the emotional maturity is a big thing that I've been working on, particularly since discovering the EA teachings. So it's like grow up within myself and stop externalizing all this stuff, grow up inside and take that internal responsibility. And with that comes that that sense of, like you sort of said before, earlier, in even with the last person you were talking to, really owning everything, and then you become that co-creator in your life. You're not a victim to it anymore.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, exactly. And again,
Mm.
both charts here have the early 60s. So we have that Uranus balsamic Pluto. You've got the double signature Virgo 6. So you know, what is naturally to atone for? What's just got caught
Mm.
up in conditioning patterns, okay? But this right here, this Uranus balsamic Pluto, as you're going through this emotional maturity through the experience of life, there is a lesson in objectivity, and it's reiterated by the ruler of this south node and ruling the resolution node. This is another double signature of objectivity. In
Mm.
other words, moving beyond the immediacy of a situation and being able to reflect upon it to see what was my
Mm.
role in creating this. And then your whole inner being, all of these inner planets right here, are going to be able to calm down. Jupiter and Aries
Yep.
rules all of these. There's a lot of feistiness in your chart, and yet this emotional moon signature is just being, you know, emotionally absent.
Mm.
Again, having the emotionally abusive and cold mother.
Yep.
This caused you to emotionally withdraw and check out. Or
Yeah.
as you
Her
yourself,
Mars.
go ahead.
Sorry. Her
No,
Mars sits right on my moon too.
oh boy. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's no wonder then that you went to alcohol at this puberty. Um, it was a way to get in touch emotionally. Even
Mm.
though it wasn't necessarily a healthy emotional way, it did allow you to open up and feel the emotions rather than all this clamping down and suppressing or
Mm.
picking up your fists and going for the fight.
Yep.
And so,
Yeah, particularly after that move, because before that, nature was the way that I dealt with,
yeah.
and working with spirit, being with spirit in nature and just going off on my own. But once that stopped, I had to find a new way, and I didn't have any tools.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And another
Yeah.
thing that goes on, with your chart, you have the grand trine with the north
Mm.
node in water, sign and house. And so what can
Yep.
happen with this water trine? The distortions of it are once your emotions get going, there's nothing to slow them down. That
Mm.
that 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 emotional, again, trine energy, and especially grand trine energy, it's ease of effort, and the effort can be distorted or the effort can be naturally expressed. And so you either have that ability to make the effort and deeply understand on emotional levels, or you can trigger the wounding, you can trigger the get them before they get me, and the hurt little child just emotionally goes off the deep end or emotionally goes to extremes, fueled by the Jupiter square the nodes. And, again, your emotions just come flying out because this moon signature in Pisces 12th house, there's no there's no boundaries emotionally.
No. Yep. That's
So
true.
yes, it provides the psychic levels, the psychic intuition here from your clairvoyant readings, but it also is I'm emotionally checked out. Personally, I'm not here emotionally. And so at the spark of a hat, you could get emotionally triggered and then boom, you're just all over. And so yes, the resolution note here is about that emotional maturity, that ability to recognize what is my role in the play. I am a co-creator
Mm-hmm.
of this, and then you will evolve this emotional grand trine into emotionally processing. And
Mm.
if you develop the healthy boundaries, what's emotionally mine, what's not emotionally mine, if you develop those healthy emotional boundaries, then you can be very helpful to others processing their emotions.
Mm. Yeah, I have done a lot of that work with people over the years. I've also, in that, struggled with those boundaries within myself too, but I have got better at that. And I feel like now I'm in a much better place with it all. And I have sort of learnt that art of detachment, and not be so caught up in the whole um, emotional side of things. Because, yeah, it
Mm-hmm.
did used to really throw me. Mm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't differentiate what was mine, what wasn't mine. And yeah, it's taken me a while to come to terms with all that.
Yeah. You also have been really, kind of working. If you look at the fact that you've got, what is it, Sun and Mercury in waxing squares to Uranus, Pluto, there's there's a lot in your chart as well that signifies all of the religious distortions and
Mm,
conditionings,
mm,
and really having to understand natural spiritual laws and principles and then walk your talk, seeking out your
yeah.
truth. That will also allow you to calm down. I've noticed in EA that we draw in a lot of Jupiter square the nodes and Neptune square the nodes.
Mm-hmm.
If you've not heard this before, one of my jokes as an astrologer doing clients, Jupiter square the nodes, Neptune square the nodes. I draw in the clients. And and so when you have Jupiter square the nodes, regardless of sign and house, now it will, you can read this into Aries first house as well, but because there's skip steps in understanding and there's skip steps in processing and assimilating, okay?
Mm,
Jupiter is how do we make sense of something? And so with Jupiter square the nodes, I have a tendency to say there's three steps to it. First of all, how is something initially presenting itself that triggers you? Skip steps and triggers you to where you stop processing and you just want to react or postulate. Jupiter wants to go into, now let me tell you. And so how is it what's presenting itself to trigger? And if you can understand the trigger, then what is it that is mine to work through, processing, assimilating, understanding? And then the third step is, well, what did that all mean?
mm,
So you can almost, you understand how I'm saying that? One, two, three. And
yeah.
then that's how Jupiter, because what Jupiter's going to do is bounce back and forth between the inner wounded child and the heavy-handed adult.
Mm,
Or with your Jupiter, Aries first house, and how this came in, the frustration at not being able to be free. And
mm,
and so the inner wounded child then can get into manipulating through victimization. The heavy-handed adult just wants to go out and take charge and be heavy-handed. So what we have here is a skip step as a mature adult. And
yep.
that's one of what your recovery processes is. in
Mm.
with this signature. And so again, how's the situation presenting itself? Who's showing up? My inner wounded child, my heavy-handed adult, both of them. What does the child have to do? What does the parent or adult have to do? What's mine to work through and process from both of those extremes, bouncing back and forth within me? And so then the third part of working, assimilating, understanding to what does it all mean, that's where you come into being the mature adult versus the child or parent. Make sense?
Yep. Yeah, it does. Yeah. And that's very much what I've been working towards these last probably 3 or so years.
Good.
And, really like Jeffrey's teaching, particularly with that Jupiter square the nodes, has really helped me understand that part of me.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was when Pluto was conjunct my South Node, as it was coming up to that, I was very aware that it was a very significant thing, and that's actually when I discovered Jeffrey's teachings.
Mm-hmm. There you
And
go.
discovered that square and what that meant for me, and it sort of gave me a good kick up the backside.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
And it also gave you that ultimate freedom, the
Yes,
freedom of understanding.
yes,
And you could
yes,
really start working to integrate it on a very conscious level. Saturn 10th house.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And I've just recently, you were talking about, earlier you were saying about being able to let everything go. My husband and I have just recently sold our house and basically everything, and are pretty much down to a backpack each, and we've started to travel the world. So we're putting ourselves in the hands of source energy to guide us, and yeah, we've just let go of work and everything, and that's a massive step for us because we've both been parents for such a long time too, and very intensely focused parents in as much as always being there for the kids. And yeah, it's sort of like we've taken that leap now. It's okay, this is about us, we need to move forward in a different way, still be there obviously for our family, but it's taken a different shift. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It
I
feels
just
good.
good for you. Good, good. And I've just realized time. So questions from, are there any questions you have for me or anybody on the board with questions, Leroy? All right. So, well, I thank both of our volunteers for today. I really appreciate you letting us utilize your charts in our deepening understandings of EA. Here are our future classes. August, next month, I'm still looking for a volunteer who has South Node in the 9th house. I have my South Node in Sag. I can get by with one volunteer, but I do like to do the different house and sign so we get as much learning as we can. And of course, you can see what I've got right here. I think I just got a volunteer. I can't remember if it was 5th house or Leo, but somebody emailed me recently, so I will fill that one in. And I did decide on dates for Jupiter and Libra. The public webinars, we have our free Mercury retrograde in Virgo, August 29th, in Capricorn Sag, December 12th. And I will do my two-part series that I do once a year on Jupiter in Libra, September 12th, and Jupiter in Libra through the 12 houses, September 19th. And so, if there are no other questions or comments, I will let everybody go. Leroy, you seem a little silent. And so thank you everyone for going a little extra with my delay getting on. Appreciate you all, and we'll see you next month. Adios.